In a back office behind a half-open door, someone said Elena Cruz made almost $300 a week in tips. Then the same voice added that some of that money was shaved off, and a man sitting outside heard every single word. What he heard was not one ugly mistake by one bad manager having one reckless moment on a random morning. It was the sound of a system speaking plainly. A system built so rewards moved upward while fear settled below. A supervisor skimmed tips, a regional director collected bonuses, and a board praised clean numbers from far away. Meanwhile, Elena Cruz stood 8 hours a day with aching feet and shaking hands, watching her money disappear. She carried plates, poured coffee, smiled at strangers, and stayed silent because she knew what honesty could cost. Have you ever watched something wrong happen right in front of you and still chosen not to speak? Not because you missed it, and not because you doubted it, but because you understood the punishment attached. How many systems around us survive by that exact logic while good people quietly calculate the price of truth? How many workers stay silent, not because they are weak, but because courage has been priced like disaster? And the man outside that office door, the one who decided not to look away, what did he risk? The answer would force anyone listening to rethink every time they chose comfort over confrontation and silence over truth. The South Atlanta location of Sunrise Diner Group was not the kind of place that appeared in corporate brochures. There was no exposed brick, no artisan coffee menu, and no smiling brunch crowd taking photos for social media. There was a narrow dining room, linoleum floors worn thin at the corners, and a counter that never felt clean. The breakfast menu had barely changed since 2009, and the whole place carried the fatigue of repetition. The neighborhood was working class, the kind that counted every dollar and valued food more than atmosphere. Construction workers came in before daylight, nurses arrived after night shifts, and retirees ordered the same meal weekly. It was exactly the kind of place Sunrise claimed it existed to serve. Whenever executives spoke about community, Elena Cruz had worked the morning shift there for 3 years and arrived at 5:45 before the fryers started. She knew regulars by name, by coffee preference, by routine, and by the quiet needs they never said aloud. Walter Bennett liked his eggs a certain way and his coffee black. And Elena Cruz remembered without asking. The woman in booth 4 always needed extra napkins for her grandson. And Elena Cruz brought them first. 2 electricians came every Friday, sat by the window, and wanted silence until after their second cup of coffee. Elena Cruz was good at her job in the invisible way that keeps a room moving without attention. She was not loud, not flashy, and not the kind of worker management publicly celebrated with speeches. But she made the room run, and most people never noticed, because smooth labor often disappears into the background. Her hourly wage was $9.20. And after taxes, a full week barely reached $300. Even tips were not extra for Elena Cruz. Tips were rent, groceries, bus fare, school needs, and breathing room. Even tips were why she took the early shift, and why she smiled through rude tables and bad mornings. They were why she stayed an extra 30 minutes when the kitchen ran behind and the room got tense. Elena Cruz had a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie Cruz, and every dollar already had a purpose. Sophie Cruz needed new shoes, and a school field trip cost $22. Elena Cruz had not found yet. For 2 weeks, Elena Cruz had moved that number around in her head, borrowing from one need to cover another. This was her life, tight, exact, and dependent on the small bills customers left beside plates and mugs. Elena Cruz had a private rule she never announced to coworkers, and never used to judge anybody else. She did not steal, not a dollar, not a sugar packet, and not a container slipped into her bag. Many workers quietly took tiny extras in a job where wages never stretched as far as life demanded. An extra meal here, a comped drink there, a small survival tax no one officially discussed in the open. Elena Cruz never touched any of it. Not because she feared being caught and not because she felt superior. It was harder to explain than that. She believed there was a version of yourself you had to protect. She learned it from her mother, who worked 2 jobs and still counted exact church money every Sunday. Her mother never turned it into a lesson. She simply lived that way. And Elena Cruz understood. There was a self you had to preserve so you could meet your own eyes without flinching later. More than that, so you could look at your child and know you had not traded your core away. Elena Cruz paid that price quietly every day through patience, restraint, and the refusal to become smaller inside. When customers were rude, she did not retaliate with slow refills, cold food, or tiny acts of revenge. When a coworker made a mistake that spilled into her section, Elena Cruz covered without complaint. When the kitchen fell behind and tempers rose, she absorbed frustration the way some people absorb weather. She was steady, present, and calm in a way that made angry people soften before they understood why. That was not weakness, though Elena Cruz knew many people in power liked to confuse quiet with easy control. Between one table and the next, she carried a thought she had never spoken to anyone out loud. Even people in power count on good people staying small, and sometimes they rename that trap humility. Elena Cruz had not decided what to do with that thought yet, so she kept carrying plates and waiting. In 3 weeks before that Tuesday, Elena Cruz received a legal letter left in her mailbox, like old bad news. It came from her landlord's attorney and said the building had been sold to new ownership. The units would be converted into condominiums, and tenants had 60 days to move or buy at market rate. The market rate for Elena Cruz's apartment was $187,000. She read the number 3 times, folded the letter carefully, and went to make Sophie Cruz's breakfast. She told nobody, not her mother, not coworkers, because she had learned to carry hard things alone. It was not pride. Sharing a problem rarely made it lighter. It usually just spread the fear around. From that day on, 60 days ran quietly behind everything Elena Cruz did, at work and at home. Her savings were $2,400, built over 18 months of cutting every possible corner. Section 8 waiting lists in Atlanta ran 18 to 24 months, which might as well have been forever. 2 affordable apartments were already rented by the time Elena Cruz called, and a third vanished after she mentioned a child. The landlord paused after hearing about Sophie Cruz, then suddenly remembered the unit was unavailable after all. One real option remained. Her cousin, Marcus Reed, had a spare room in Decatur 40 minutes away by bus, but moving there meant Sophie Cruz would lose her school, her teacher, her friend, and her walk home. Elena Cruz promised herself she would not let that happen, which meant every dollar had to stay with her. Every shift mattered. Every table mattered. And every tip already belonged to some urgent need in her life. But each morning, Vanessa Cole's hand crossed Elena Cruz's section like a slow tide, taking what was not hers. Vanessa Cole moved with the calm confidence of someone who had not been told no in a very long time. The clock was running on Elena Cruz, though she did not know someone else had started timing it too. Adrian Wells had not planned to stay long the first morning. He stopped at the South Atlanta diner. He was on a detour between his hotel and corporate headquarters, restless before a board meeting later that day. He ordered coffee and the 2-egg breakfast special, opened his laptop, and expected to leave in 30 minutes. He noticed Elena Cruz first because she worked with a kind of skill most people only see when it is gone. She wasted no motion, carried 4 plates without a tray, and placed each one at the correct table without asking. She refilled Adrian Wells's coffee before he thought to request it, and never made the gesture look dramatic. In another place, that instinct would be called exceptional service. Here it was simply Tuesday morning labor. What finally pulled Adrian Wells away from his screen was not Elena Cruz, but Vanessa Cole's movement. She moved with ownership, with ease, and with the proprietary rhythm of someone who believed the room was hers. At table 7, a customer left a folded bill beside a plate and walked toward the door. Vanessa Cole reached the table within seconds and picked up the bill before touching anything else. She did not clear the dishes first. She took the cash first, smoothly, like reclaiming her own property. Elena Cruz saw it happen, and Adrian Wells saw Elena Cruz see it. Then he saw her glance toward the camera near the register, and then back toward table 7. The camera did not cover that table. The speed of her glance said she had known that for a long time. Her expression held something quieter than anger and deeper than resignation, something shaped by repeated loss. Adrian Wells kept his laptop open, but stopped pretending to work and asked for another cup of coffee. He settled deeper into the booth and began paying real attention to what the room was trying not to show. Some patterns do not announce themselves loudly. They wait for the right observer to sit still enough. Adrian Wells came back the next morning, and the morning after that, changing jackets and booth positions. He ordered small things, coffee, toast, sometimes eggs, and watched the floor with careful patience. By the 4th visit, the pattern was no longer something he could dismiss as a misunderstanding. Vanessa Cole collected tips only from Elena Cruz's tables, never from other servers, and never from the counter staff. The explanations rotated smoothly. Drawer adjustment, tax documentation, audit verification, regional policy update. The words changed, but the outcome did not, and repetition had polished the lie into something managerial. In Vanessa Cole's mind, it no longer felt like theft. It felt like routine. That was when Adrian Wells met the problem he had not expected to find in a diner booth. He was the CEO. He could stand up, identify himself, and end Elena Cruz's losses in 60 seconds. One phone call could stop it, restore her tips, and clear the room of immediate danger. But an instant fix would only solve Elena Cruz's problem, not expose whoever had built the structure above her. He needed to know whether Vanessa Cole acted alone or whether the company had quietly taught her how. If he moved too early, anyone above her would have time to clean records and align explanations. Even documents would disappear, language would tighten, and the next server at the next diner would stand alone. So Adrian Wells made a choice that felt ugly even to him. For now, he did nothing. He watched a woman lose money she had earned and stayed silent because the deeper story was still hidden. Was that strategy or complicity? Was it patience serving justice or morality bending under convenience? Adrian Wells did not have a clean answer, only a phone in his pocket and a growing certainty. He also noticed something else. He was not the only person in that diner who saw what was happening. The other morning server, Jordan Price, about 23, always wore his apron tied a little too loose. Adrian Wells saw Jordan Price notice Vanessa Cole's movements, pause, and then look away. The cook at the pass-through saw it too, his eyes following the money with exhausted recognition. Even some customers sensed something was wrong, though they lacked a safe way to challenge it. One morning, Walter Bennett slipped a $5 bill directly into Elena Cruz's apron pocket. He did not explain himself. He just opened his newspaper and refused to make the gesture public. Elena Cruz looked at him with gratitude so tightly compressed, it almost hurt to witness. So why did no one say anything? The answer was ordinary, practical, and brutally honest. Jordan Price had rent. The cook had a family. Customers had no standing inside the company at all. Elena Cruz had 60 days to secure housing and a daughter whose life she was trying to protect. She had no union, no HR advocate on site, and no access to the records proving the theft. The only thing Elena Cruz had that Vanessa Cole did not was the truth. And in that room, truth had no institutional weight because the system had not been built to hold it. This is how such systems survive, not through secrecy, but through carefully priced silence and unequal risk. The machine does not need everyone to participate. It only needs enough people to decide resistance costs too much. So Jordan Price retied his apron. The cook turned back to the grill. And breakfast continued. It happened on the 5th morning, during the peak rush, when the diner was loud enough to hide most wrongs. Adrian Wells sat in the corner booth with coffee in hand, and his phone face down on the table. Every booth was full, the counter was packed, and Elena Cruz moved through the room with steady precision. Then a man in a contractor's vest left a $20 bill on table 9 and walked out. Vanessa Cole was at the table in less than 10 seconds, but Elena Cruz was still clearing plates. She saw Vanessa Cole's hand move toward the bill, and for one small suspended moment, she did not step back. She did not accuse, beg, or protest. She simply stayed present and refused to pretend she had not seen. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but those seconds held the entire shape of the power between them. Vanessa Cole met Elena Cruz's eyes, smiled, and pocketed the bill with practiced contempt. That smile was the moment Adrian Wells checked that his voice memo was still recording. Then he texted his assistant one short message. Cancel my 9 o'clock. Clear the rest of this week. He did not do it for drama. He did it because waiting no longer felt neutral. He now knew he was the only person in that building with real authority, and nothing left to wait for. Some decisions do not feel dramatic when they happen. They feel like the last sensible thing still available. He ordered another coffee and stayed in the booth while the room kept moving around him. That afternoon, Vanessa Cole called Elena Cruz into the back office and closed the door. The meeting lasted 4 minutes, and Elena Cruz understood the shape of it before it truly began. Vanessa Cole said a customer had complained about slow service and attitude earlier that day. The complaint was vague enough to be impossible to disprove, and specific enough to stain a file. She documented it as a formal written warning and slid the paper across the desk for signature. It looked official, clean, and final, the way punishment often looks when systems know how to dress themselves. Elena Cruz signed the acknowledgement because she understood what arguing would become in a room like that. An argument would become insubordination, and insubordination would become termination with no safety net below. Termination would become housing instability for her and Sophie Cruz, and she could not risk that yet. So Elena Cruz signed, returned to the floor, and kept moving with the same steady hands. That night, walking to the bus stop in the cold, she did the math again. The warning meant she was now one incident away from losing the only income holding her life together. The tips Vanessa Cole kept taking were no longer just unfair. They now threatened her job itself. Elena Cruz had tried to exist with dignity inside a system that kept changing the terms of survival. The system had answered by escalating. That is what happens when silence is profitable and goodness is exploitable. 3 days later, Vanessa Cole made her move in public during the busiest Friday morning shift. Every booth was filled, the counter was 3 deep, and the kitchen was running at full volume. Even Elena Cruz was handling 6 tables at once, moving with practiced speed and controlled breath. A woman at table 3, dressed in business casual and clearly in a hurry, flagged her down. The woman pressed $30 into Elena Cruz's hand and said she was the best server she had seen in years. Then the woman added, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Do not let anyone tell you different." For one brief second, kindness entered the room like a small act of rescue. Elena Cruz smiled, folded the bills, and moved to place them in her apron pocket. Then Vanessa Cole's voice came from directly behind her, close, calm, and deliberate. She said she needed to take the money for drawer reconciliation and tax documentation. Elena Cruz replied quietly that the customer had given it directly to her by hand. Vanessa Cole answered just as quietly that gratuities over 20 had to be processed through management. She said Elena Cruz's name with flat dismissal. Not angry, just certain of her own protected power. Then she added that a cash handling violation could join the warning already in Elena Cruz's file. Under threat in public, Elena Cruz handed over the $30 and watched it leave her hand. The woman at table 3 looked shocked, then ashamed, and then looked down at her phone instead of speaking. The room resumed, but Adrian Wells had his recorder running and now had clean evidence of coercion. Even that same Friday afternoon, Elena Cruz did something she had delayed for weeks. She called corporate HR. The hotline number was posted on a laminated employee rights sign in the break room. Beneath the Sunrise logo, the sign promised that your voice matters, as if a slogan could be structure. Elena Cruz sat on hold for 11 minutes before a representative finally answered. She explained everything carefully, giving dates, amounts, the warning, and the language Vanessa Cole kept using. She kept her voice steady because panic is often mistaken for unreliability when workers ask institutions for help. The representative listened and then said tip policies varied by location and management discretion. Any formal complaint, she was told, had to be submitted in writing and routed through Russell Kane. Everyone at the South Atlanta diner knew that name. Russell Kane was the regional director. He visited once a quarter, praised the coffee, shook hands, spoke about the Sunrise family, and left. Every time he came through, he spoke privately with Vanessa Cole, and she looked stronger afterward. Elena Cruz thanked the representative, hung up, and sat in the parking lot with the engine off. She understood then that the system meant to protect her had been routed directly through the people above her abuser. She had one warning in her file, no records proving theft, and no witness willing to speak on paper. She had 41 days left on her eviction notice, and no safe process standing between her and collapse. This is what institutional protection looks like when it is built for liability management, instead of accountability. The poster stays on the wall, the hotline stays open, and the vulnerable still remain the least protected. Elena Cruz drove home, made dinner, helped Sophie Cruz study spelling, and told nobody what she had done. Jordan Price had seen everything, not just the Friday confrontation, but the pattern stretching back for months. He worked the same shift as Elena Cruz, crossed the same floor, and heard the same explanations repeated. Drawer adjustment, tax documentation, audit verification, always the same words, always the same missing money. Over time, Jordan Price did the math and knew exactly what was happening in that diner. He was 23, had $340 in checking, and still owed money on a car repair. His mother in Birmingham was sick in the slow, expensive way that meant bus tickets and missed shifts. He liked Elena Cruz in the plain, decent way you like someone who always shows up with integrity. More than once, he considered saying something to her, to someone above Vanessa Cole, to anyone at all. But he had no records, no access, and no realistic reason to believe reporting would protect him. If he spoke and nothing happened, and he had seen enough to expect exactly that, she would know. His shifts would shrink, his section would change, and the paperwork would start building against him too. So Jordan Price stayed quiet and hated himself for it in the low, constant way people hate surrender. The morning after Elena Cruz's HR call, he watched Vanessa Cole intercept another tip from table 2. He stood only a few feet away, looked directly at her, and she looked directly back. Neither of them said anything. He picked up his tray and turned to the next table. Silence from the inside does not feel like cowardice at first. It feels like survival until later. 31 days remained on Elena Cruz's notice, and she began writing the number on a folded paper in her apron. It was not to remind herself. She needed no reminder. It was to give pressure a physical shape. 31 days to find housing she could afford, in a school district Sophie Cruz could stay in. 31 days to keep her daughter's life intact, while standing one documented incident away from unemployment. She called 4 more apartments that week and met the same wall in 4 different forms. 2 were already rented. 1 required credit she knew she would not pass. And 1 changed tone after hearing child. The unpaid medical bill came from Sophie Cruz's ear infection years earlier, when insurance was out of reach. The 4th landlord asked who would live in the unit, paused after hearing about her daughter, and vanished. Marcus Reed's spare room was still there, but taking it meant asking Sophie Cruz to start over. 3 times that week, Elena Cruz drove past her daughter's school and imagined the conversation she could not bear. "We are moving, baby. You will make new friends. It will be okay." None of it felt honest enough. Something tightened in her chest every time she pictured Sophie Cruz losing her teacher and her friend. At work, Elena Cruz kept smiling, timing coffee refills, remembering napkins, and hiding every fracture. Then Vanessa Cole issued a second informal advisory and logged it as table turnover inconsistency. It was not enough to fire someone by itself, but it was enough to build toward something. Elena Cruz understood the architecture. Vanessa Cole was building a paper case 1 patient brick at a time. The clock was no longer running in one direction. It was counting down housing and employment together. What changed everything was not a dramatic confession under a spotlight. It was a half-open office door. Adrian Wells arrived earlier than usual that Tuesday and chose the booth nearest the back hallway on purpose. Over the previous week, he had noticed Vanessa Cole spent the first 30 minutes of every shift on the phone. The door was always mostly shut but never fully latched, the casual carelessness of repeated success. Adrian Wells started his voice memo before sitting down, then let the room wake up around him. At 6:14 a.m., Vanessa Cole's voice came clearly through the gap, relaxed and pleased. She said the numbers looked good for the week, and labor was sitting at 26.8. Then a male voice came through the speakerphone, flattened by distance, but familiar in authority. It had the rhythm of a man used to giving direction without asking questions and being obeyed immediately. The voice said to keep labor under 28, and that corporate did not need tip breakdowns. Then Vanessa Cole said, "Elena Cruz pulls in almost $300 a week in tips." She added, "I shave some off and the margins look perfect." As calmly as someone reading inventory, the man answered, "That is what I need from you, Vanessa Cole." Russell Kane out. Adrian Wells sat completely still while his coffee cooled and the dining room began filling around him. Until that moment, he had suspected a corrupt supervisor. Now he had a regional director on record. This was not opportunistic theft anymore. It was systematic suppression of tips to improve labor cost metrics. It was deliberate, profitable, and tied to a bonus structure that rewarded outcomes without naming methods. The audio mattered, but Adrian Wells knew one recording alone would not survive every legal attack. Lawyers could question context, interpretation, audio clarity, or intent if stronger evidence did not support it. He still needed point-of-sale records, shift logs, timestamps, and a documented pattern no excuse could cover. But for the first time in 2 weeks, Adrian Wells held something solid enough to build a real case. The office door had opened just wide enough, and the people behind it had said too much. 3 hours after Adrian Wells quietly left that diner, Vanessa Cole terminated Elena Cruz's employment. The paperwork was polished, professional, and arranged to survive even a quick internal review. It cited 3 incidents: the written warning, the shift log advisory, and a new customer complaint that morning. Elena Cruz had never been told about that last complaint and could not verify or dispute it. Vanessa Cole walked her through the termination in the back office with HR forms spread neatly across the desk. She handed over the final paycheck, escorted Elena Cruz to the locker, and asked for the apron back. Elena Cruz drove home in silence and parked outside the building she had only 30 days left in. She did not cry right away. First, she did the numbers, because that was how she absorbed shock. Unemployment would take weeks. Her final check covered 6 days. Her savings could barely hold 1 more month. Rent, food, school costs, bus fare, nothing aligned in a way that allowed the math to keep working. Then a harder question rose under the numbers, one she had been trying not to ask herself. 11. Stepped back sooner and made herself smaller? Would she still have her job tonight? Probably yes, she thought. She would still be losing tips. But maybe she would still have income. This is the arithmetic of silence. Lose a little now, so you do not lose everything later. What that arithmetic hides is that the loss never stays small. It compounds until your life is negotiated away. The system that first takes your tips will eventually take your hours, your file, your job, and your peace. Elena Cruz had done everything right, and she had still lost, which is sometimes the cruelest lesson. 29 days remained on the eviction notice, and she had no plan that did not cost Sophie Cruz something. That night, Elena Cruz told Sophie Cruz they were having a special dinner and made blueberry pancakes. Pancakes like that were usually for birthdays or hard Fridays when sweetness had to interrupt the week. Sophie Cruz was 7, and 7-year-olds accept pancakes for dinner without demanding explanations. At the kitchen table with the wobbly leg, Sophie Cruz talked about missing the word necessary on a spelling test. She did not understand why it needed 2 C's when 1 seemed enough, and Elena Cruz laughed at the right places. After dinner, while Sophie Cruz was in the bath, Elena Cruz sat with a yellow legal pad. She wrote every number she had: 0 income, savings, $2,400, rent due in 12 days. She added field trip balance 22, bus fare 34, groceries 180 if she stayed careful. Then she stared at the column until the numbers stopped feeling like information and started feeling like a sentence. Finally, she flipped the legal pad face down because sometimes not seeing the numbers is the only mercy. She thought about her mother and the deliberate steadiness she carried through hard rooms without bitterness or theater. Her mother had never said dignity was practical, but she had lived as if surrender carried its own costs. Even Elena Cruz was not sure she believed that tonight. Tonight, dignity felt less noble than expensive. Sophie Cruz came out in damp pajamas, smelling like almost finished strawberry shampoo, and climbed into her mother's lap. Children sense change before they can name it, and Sophie Cruz rested there without asking questions. They sat together for a long time while the legal pad stayed face down on the table beside them. Adrian Wells learned about the termination at 7:43 that evening, not from Elena Cruz, but from his assistant. She had spent the afternoon pulling personnel records through a compliance channel routed around Russell Kane. The termination paperwork had been filed at 2:17 p.m. and was as clean as any corporate document. Adrian Wells read it twice, then called general counsel, and that conversation lasted 40 focused minutes. By the end, 2 things were in motion: a legal hold and a plan for direct intervention. All personnel and point-of-sale records from the South Atlanta diner were frozen going back 6 months. A meeting was set for the following Tuesday morning during peak breakfast rush with no warning given to the store. During the days between, Adrian Wells, compliance staff, and outside labor counsel reviewed everything available. The point-of-sale data told the story with the brutal precision numbers can have when finally examined honestly. Across 22 weeks, cash tip entries from Elena Cruz's tables showed repeated post-shift reductions. The deductions were coded as drawer discrepancies, tax withholding corrections, and audit offsets. Each one was small enough to hide by itself, but together they formed a clear and ugly pattern. The total stolen from Elena Cruz was $2,847. Every one of those adjustments was time-stamped and authorized under Vanessa Cole's supervisor credentials. Other servers showed no comparable adjustments during the same period, not even once. Combined with the audio recording and the HR routing record, the picture hinge was no longer arguable. Counsel confirmed the recording was legally obtained under Georgia's one-party consent law. By Tuesday morning, the company no longer had suspicion. It had proof, pattern, intent, and a chain upward. Adrian Wells arrived at 7:15 a.m. in ordinary clothes, sat in booth 7 again, and ordered coffee. He waited through the rush with the calm of a man who had already decided how the scene would end. At 8:52, Vanessa Cole reached across table 4 and lifted a $15 bill left by a customer. It was the same motion as always, unhurried and proprietary, the gesture of someone who believed she was protected. Adrian Wells stood up and said one word, "Stop," in a voice that did not need volume. Silence spread in stages, first at the counter, then through the booths, then toward the kitchen pass-through. He removed his cap and said, "My name is Adrian Wells. I am the CEO of Sunrise Diner Group." Then he told the room he had been sitting in that diner for the past week watching and documenting. He looked directly at Vanessa Cole and said he had recorded her taking Elena Cruz's tips more than once. Vanessa Cole answered instantly with denial, policy language, and the same practiced administrative tone. Drawer reconciliation, tax documentation, audit verification. She repeated the phrases like armor around herself. Adrian Wells took out his phone and pressed play for the whole room to hear. Vanessa Cole's voice came through clearly. Elena Cruz pulls in almost $300 a week in tips. Then the room heard the next line too. "I shave some off. The margins look perfect." The color drained from Vanessa Cole's face as the structure she trusted began to split open. Adrian Wells did not raise his voice or perform outrage. The facts were enough. He turned to the room and said, "What happened to Elena Cruz was wage theft, documented and systematic." Then he said it had been enabled by a regional structure, rewarded for favorable labor numbers. He turned back to Vanessa Cole and terminated her employment on the spot for wage theft. He said HR and legal would be in contact that same day, and then took out his phone again. Then on speaker, he called Russell Kane in front of staff, customers, and the suddenly silent dining room. The line rang 4 times before Russell Kane answered with the calm of a man expecting nothing unusual. Adrian Wells said he had a recording of Russell Kane directing tip suppression to protect labor margins. He said he was standing in the South Atlanta dining room with witnesses and asked if he wanted to respond. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for several people in the room to exchange glances. Russell Kane finally spoke, but nothing he said helped him, and nothing he said changed what had been captured. Before noon, Adrian Wells authorized an independent labor compliance audit of all 12 Southeast locations. Before the week ended, the scope expanded because the first findings looked too familiar to be isolated. 4 more locations showed comparable irregularities tied to the same regional cost target structure. Each one produced artificially favorable labor metrics that had helped Russell Kane collect his bonuses. The machine had been running quietly for years. It only needed someone to stop looking away long enough. 45 days, 17 employees across the Southeast region received $186,000. That number sounded neat when spoken aloud, but it represented months of lost mornings and stolen dignity. It was not a windfall. It was a debt finally paid back with money that could not restore time. Elena Cruz received full restitution, $2,847 plus damages. Her termination was reversed, removed from her record, and formally acknowledged as retaliatory and unjust. Adrian Wells personally offered Elena Cruz the floor lead position in a private conversation. The talk lasted longer than either of them expected because he listened before he explained anything. 6 months later, Elena Cruz was promoted to assistant general manager at the same diner. 1 year after that, she became general manager of the South Atlanta location. It was the same dining room where she had once watched her tips disappear and counted field trip monies. On the day she signed the general manager contract, Adrian Wells told her what leadership meant to him. He said leadership was not protecting margins at any cost. It was building systems where honesty was safe. Elena Cruz nodded and then told him about the yellow legal pad she had turned face down that night. She described the column of numbers that stopped working no matter how many times she rearranged them. Adrian Wells listened without interrupting. which mattered more to Elena Cruz than he realized in that moment. Later, she said it was the first time someone with real authority had listened before deciding what to say. Vanessa Cole settled a civil wage theft claim and repaid stolen wages plus penalties. She never held a management position again, and her power ended as quickly as it had once expanded. Russell Kane left the restaurant industry quietly, diminished by the questions he could no longer avoid. Sunrise rebuilt executive compensation from the ground up after the audit exposed what bad incentives had created. The new structure weighted bonuses toward employee retention, anonymous staff satisfaction, compliance, and only then profit. 40% came from retention, 30% from satisfaction, 20% from audit results, and 10% from margin. The point-of-sale system was updated so every tip required direct server acknowledgement before closeout. Sunrise also voluntarily reported the violations to the United States Department of Labor. Inside the South Atlanta diner, a small, laminated sign now sits at every table. It reads, "Your tip belongs to your server." Always, simple language where silence once protected theft. 2 years later, the Southeast region posted the highest employee retention rate in company history. Sunrise published its first annual tip transparency and workplace integrity report, so the story became structure. Remember this: when a system punishes honesty, change the system, protect the worker, and never price truth like ruin.